Imagine being born into complete darkness. No touch, no warmth, no voice to comfort you. Just silence and isolation, stretching on for days, weeks, months, until your mind breaks. Imagine screaming for help, but no one hears you, fighting to escape only to realize that nothing you do will ever change your fate. Now imagine this isn't a nightmare. This was real. This was science. In the 1950s and 60s, one psychologist conducted experiments so disturbing that even his colleagues called them monstrous. He claimed he was studying love, but what he really did was systematically destroy the minds of baby monkeys, isolating them, depriving them, breaking them. Some were driven to madness. Others never recovered. This is not just a story of cruelty. It's a story of how far science has been willing to go in the pursuit of knowledge. Monkey head transplants, Dr. Robert White's shocking experiment. In the 1970s, Dr. Robert White, an American neurosurgeon, conducted one of the most shocking and disturbing animal experiments in the history of medical science: the transplanting of a living monkey's head onto another monkey's body. His goal was ambitious, even audacious, to prove that a human head transplant could one day be possible, allowing people with degenerative diseases or paralyzed bodies to be given new, functioning ones. But in the process, he carried out what many consider an act of extreme cruelty. The experiment began with two living monkeys, one that would serve as the donor body, and another whose head would be transplanted. Both animals were fully anesthetized, and a team of surgeons worked meticulously to remove their heads while keeping their brains oxygenated. This required precise surgical techniques to cut and reconnect major blood vessels in a way that would prevent the brain from dying. Advanced vascular suturing techniques were used to maintain circulation, a process that required years of refinement and practice. After hours of intricate surgery, the head of one monkey was successfully attached to the body of another. Astonishingly, the transplanted monkey regained consciousness. It opened its eyes. It could move its mouth. It could track movement with its eyes. It even showed awareness, recognizing researchers in the room. But the horrific reality of the experiment became clear almost immediately. The monkey had no control over its new body. The spinal cord had been severed during the transplant, and at the time, medical science had no way of reconnecting spinal nerves. The animal was completely paralyzed from the neck down. Despite this, the monkey survived for a brief period, living long enough for researchers to observe its condition. It could breathe with the aid of medical support, and its brain function appeared intact. However, because the immune system naturally rejects foreign tissue, the new body began attacking the transplanted head. Without modern immunosuppressive drugs, rejection was inevitable. Within a few days, the monkey succumbed to complications and died. The ethical implications of the experiment were enormous. Scientists and animal rights activists alike condemned White's research, calling it cruel and inhumane. The suffering inflicted on these animals was immense, raising deep moral questions about the limits of scientific inquiry. Should the pursuit of medical advancements justify such extreme levels of suffering? Could the potential to help paralyzed individuals or those with fatal diseases ever excuse such violent procedures? Dr. White, however, defended his work. He argued that one day head transplants could save countless lives. He believed that for patients suffering from conditions like muscular dystrophy, multiple sclerosis, or severe spinal injuries, a full-body transplant could be a viable solution. If perfected, his technique could have meant that a person's mind, memories, and consciousness could live on in a completely new body. But the backlash was strong. Many saw White as a man driven not just by scientific ambition, but by an unsettling obsession with pushing the limits of life itself. The image of a conscious, thinking animal, trapped in a body it could not control, deeply disturbed both the scientific community and the general public. Decades later, White's work remains one of the most controversial chapters in medical history. While advancements in organ transplantation and neural surgery have progressed significantly since then, full head transplants remain far beyond the reach of modern medicine. Even today, the idea of a successful human head transplant raises profound ethical, medical, and philosophical questions. Would the transplanted person retain their sense of self? How would the brain adapt to a foreign body? Could this ever be done without extreme suffering? White's legacy is complicated. His research contributed to a greater understanding of brain function and transplantation, but at an enormous ethical cost. The suffering endured by the animals in his experiments is undeniable. And while his dream of human head transplants has never been realized, the debate over the morality of such procedures continues. In the end, this experiment serves as a grim reminder of the lengths to which science has gone, and sometimes still goes, in the pursuit of knowledge. It forces us to ask difficult questions. What are the ethical boundaries of scientific progress? How far should we push the limits of life and death? And most importantly, how much suffering are we willing to inflict in the name of discovery? The LD50 test, a measure of death and suffering in the name of science. Throughout the 20th century, one of the most widespread and horrific experiments conducted on animals was the LD50 test, short for lethal dose 50. This brutal procedure was designed to determine the exact dose of a chemical, drug, or toxic substance required to kill 50% of a test population. It was widely used in pharmacology, industrial chemical testing, and even in military research to assess the toxicity of poisons, pesticides, and biological agents. The test was conducted on countless animals, primarily rats, mice, rabbits, dogs, and even monkeys, subjecting them to excruciating pain and prolonged suffering. The procedure was as cruel as it was methodical. A group of animals would be force-fed, injected, or exposed to increasing doses of a chemical substance. The goal was to determine the precise amount that would lead to death in half of the test subjects while leaving the other half alive, often suffering from extreme side effects. The test lasted for hours or even days, during which the animals endured agonizing symptoms. They would experience uncontrollable convulsions, violent seizures, excruciating organ failure, internal bleeding, respiratory distress, or paralysis. Some animals foamed at the mouth, while others bled from their eyes or ears as their organs collapsed. Many would vomit uncontrollably, struggling against the pain. Those that survived the initial exposure often spent hours or days in torment before succumbing to the substance. There was no pain relief, no anesthesia, just pure, calculated suffering. And once the test was complete, the remaining animals, those that had somehow endured the torture, were typically killed to allow scientists to examine the damage to their internal organs. The entire process was considered standard scientific practice for decades. The justification for LD50 testing was that it provided precise toxicity data to help determine safe dosage levels for humans. It was used for everything, from household cleaning products to industrial pesticides, from cosmetics to pharmaceutical drugs. Companies and regulatory agencies argued that the results were necessary to prevent human poisoning and accidental overdoses. But at what cost? By the mid-20th century, as knowledge of animal sentience and suffering grew, ethical concerns surrounding LD50 testing exploded. Critics pointed out that the tests were not only extremely cruel, but also scientifically flawed. Animal biology differs significantly from human biology, meaning the toxicity levels found in animals did not always correlate with human reactions. Moreover, many of the substances tested were already known to be harmful, making the additional suffering entirely unnecessary. Why continue torturing animals to confirm what was already evident? The criticism reached a breaking point in the late 20th century when animal rights activists, scientists, and ethical committees began demanding alternatives. Eventually, many countries phased out LD50 testing, replacing it with more humane and scientifically valid alternatives such as cell-based tests, computational modeling, and human-based microdosing studies. However, despite growing opposition, LD50 tests are still conducted in some industries and in certain countries, particularly in the development of pharmaceuticals, pesticides, and industrial chemicals. Even today, animals continue to be subjected to lethal toxicity tests, though under different names or slightly modified protocols. While alternatives exist, many regulatory agencies still rely on outdated methods, putting countless animals through immense suffering in laboratories worldwide. The story of LD50 is a grim reminder of humanity's long history of sacrificing animals in the name of scientific advancement. It forces us to question the morality of our past and the necessity of such experiments today. How much suffering are we willing to inflict for the sake of human convenience? And with modern technology offering ethical alternatives, can we finally move beyond such cruelty? The Soviet space dogs, sacrificed for the stars. During the early years of the space race, the Soviet Union sought to push the boundaries of human exploration by sending living beings into space. But before humans could travel beyond Earth's atmosphere, scientists needed to determine whether life could survive in the extreme conditions of space travel. Unfortunately, this meant that countless animals, particularly stray dogs, were sacrificed in experiments that subjected them to unimaginable suffering. The most infamous of these was Laika, a small mixed-breed dog who became the first living creature to orbit Earth. But behind her legendary status is a tragic story of cruelty, deception, and suffering. Laika was chosen from the streets of Moscow, selected specifically because stray dogs were believed to be more resilient to harsh conditions. Soviet scientists trained her under brutal conditions, confining her in tiny, cramped spaces for extended periods, spinning her in centrifuges to simulate rocket acceleration, and exposing her to extreme temperature variations. These experiments were designed to prepare her for the intense forces of space travel, but they also caused extreme stress, fear, and physical harm. On November 3, 1957, Laika was placed inside Sputnik 2, a spacecraft that had no plan for re-entry. The Soviet Union had no technology to bring her back safely, and despite early claims that she would be euthanized painlessly before her oxygen ran out, the reality was much worse. Shortly after launch, sensors recorded that Laika's heart rate had tripled from stress. She struggled against the harness and extreme G-forces of takeoff. Within minutes, the temperature inside the capsule began to rise uncontrollably due to a malfunction in the spacecraft's thermal system. The heat climbed beyond survivable levels, and after just a few painful hours of suffering, alone, terrified, and trapped in a metal coffin, Laika succumbed to overheating and stress. Despite Soviet officials initially claiming she had survived for days before being humanely euthanized, decades later, documents revealed the heartbreaking truth. She died in agony just a few hours after launch. Laika was not the only victim. The Soviet space program sent dozens of other dogs into space, many of whom never returned. Some were killed upon impact when their capsules failed to deploy parachutes. Others were lost in space, their lifeless bodies orbiting Earth as silent reminders of their sacrifice. Even those who survived often endured painful medical procedures, isolation, and repeated launches. One of the rare success stories was Belka and Strelka, two dogs who were launched into space in 1960 and returned safely. However, their survival did not change the fact that the Soviet program had already condemned many animals to horrific deaths. The justification for these experiments was simple. Scientists needed data to ensure human safety in space travel. The results of Laika's mission did contribute valuable knowledge, proving that living beings could survive launch and microgravity, at least temporarily. But was it worth the suffering? In hindsight, even some Soviet scientists admitted regret. Oleg Gazenko, one of Laika's lead trainers, later expressed guilt over her death, stating, "The more time passes, the more I regret it. We did not learn enough from the mission to justify the death of the dog." Laika's story remains a symbol of both human ambition and ethical failure. While her sacrifice played a role in the advancement of space exploration, it also highlighted the cruel cost of scientific progress. Today, with the development of advanced simulations, robotics, and human volunteers, the use of animals in space research has largely been eliminated. But the memory of Laika and the many others who suffered in the name of discovery serves as a reminder of the ethical dilemmas in scientific exploration. How many lives, human or animal, should be sacrificed for progress? And as we continue to push the boundaries of knowledge, will we remember the lessons learned from these early sacrifices? Thalidomide testing, a tragedy of science and suffering. In the 1950s, a new drug called thalidomide was developed and widely marketed as a miracle cure for morning sickness, anxiety, and insomnia. Pharmaceutical companies claimed it was completely safe for pregnant women, and doctors around the world prescribed it without hesitation. However, behind this so-called medical breakthrough lay one of the most devastating drug disasters in history, one that caused unimaginable suffering for both humans and the animals used in its testing. Thalidomide was initially tested on thousands of animals, rabbits, mice, rats, dogs, and primates, before being approved for human use. These animals were force-fed or injected with high doses of the drug to study its toxicity. However, the tests failed to reveal one critical danger: the drug's devastating effects on fetal development. At the time, it was widely believed that drugs given to pregnant women could not pass through the placenta and affect the unborn child. Since the animal tests did not show severe side effects in adults, thalidomide was approved for use without proper human clinical trials. What happened next was nothing short of a nightmare. By the early 1960s, reports began emerging of horrific birth defects in babies born to mothers who had taken thalidomide. Thousands of infants were born with severely deformed limbs, some missing arms, legs, fingers, or toes entirely. Others suffered from malformed internal organs, blindness, deafness, and brain damage. Many babies were stillborn. Others died within days or months of birth due to catastrophic organ failure. In total, over 10,000 children across 46 countries were affected, making it one of the worst medical disasters of the 20th century. The worst part? It could have been prevented. After the tragedy unfolded, new animal tests were conducted, this time focusing on the drug's effects on pregnancy. Scientists discovered that thalidomide caused severe birth defects in animal fetuses, but only in certain species. The original tests had simply used the wrong animals, ones that were not as sensitive to the drug's effects as humans. This horrifying realization exposed a major flaw in animal testing. Just because a drug appears safe in one species does not mean it will be safe in another. The scandal led to sweeping reforms in drug testing and regulation. Governments around the world implemented stricter approval processes, requiring more comprehensive testing, including tests on pregnant animals. The U.S. Food and Drug Administration, FDA, strengthened its drug approval system, and new laws mandated human clinical trials before a drug could be widely distributed. However, the suffering caused by thalidomide did not end there. Even after its dangers were well known, the drug was still tested on animals for years, often in cruel and unnecessary ways. Pregnant animals were subjected to force-feeding experiments, their unborn offspring deliberately deformed in an attempt to study the drug's effects. Some tests involved amputating fetal limbs to mimic the birth defects seen in humans, despite the fact that the dangers of thalidomide were already well documented. The tragedy of thalidomide serves as a painful reminder of the failures of animal testing and the devastating consequences of rushing scientific approval without ethical considerations. It also raises a haunting question. How many other drugs have caused suffering, both to humans and animals, because of flawed testing methods? Even today, thalidomide has not entirely disappeared. Though banned for its original use, it has been repurposed for treating conditions like leprosy and certain cancers. But its legacy remains one of unimaginable suffering, a cautionary tale of what happens when science ignores ethics, and a grim testament to the failures of traditional animal testing in predicting human safety. As medicine continues to evolve, should we still rely on outdated and cruel testing methods? Or will we learn from past mistakes and prioritize ethical, human-relevant science over the suffering of innocent lives? Electroshock experiments on dogs, the birth of learned helplessness. In the 1960s, a series of psychological experiments conducted by Dr. Martin Seligman and his colleagues at the University of Pennsylvania became some of the most infamous and disturbing animal studies ever carried out. These experiments, which subjected dogs to repeated electroshocks, were designed to investigate how animals and humans respond to inescapable suffering. The results led to the concept of learned helplessness, a psychological phenomenon still referenced in studies on depression and trauma today. But the knowledge came at a terrible cost, through brutal, systematic cruelty inflicted on helpless animals. The experiments were simple, yet horrific. Dogs were placed inside metal cages designed with an electrified floor. Without warning, they were subjected to painful electric shocks at random intervals. The animals had no means of escape, no buttons to press, no levers to pull, no safe zones to retreat to. The only thing they could do was endure the pain, trapped in an environment of relentless suffering. At first, the dogs reacted as expected. They whined, struggled, barked, and frantically tried to escape. Some even leaped against the cage walls in desperate attempts to free themselves, but as the experiment continued, something terrifying happened. Eventually, the dogs stopped fighting. They lay down, trembling, accepting the pain as unavoidable. Even when the cage door was opened, allowing them an easy escape route, they didn't move. They had been conditioned to believe that no matter what they did, they could not stop their suffering. They had learned helplessness. Seligman's research was groundbreaking in psychology. He concluded that when people or animals experience repeated pain or failure with no way to control the outcome, they eventually stop trying to escape, even when a way out is available. This concept became crucial in understanding clinical depression, PTSD, and other mental health disorders. Victims of abuse, prisoners of war, and individuals suffering from severe trauma often display similar behaviors, believing they are powerless to change their circumstances. However, the ethics of these experiments were deeply questionable. The dogs were not merely test subjects. They were living, sentient beings experiencing terror, pain, and psychological breakdowns. They felt hopelessness and despair, not as an abstract theory, but as a real and horrifying experience. Despite the cruelty, the study did not end there. Seligman later attempted rehabilitation experiments, trying to reverse the learned helplessness. Some dogs were physically lifted and forced to move toward an exit, showing them that escape was possible. Eventually, some animals relearned that they could control their fate. However, this did not undo the trauma inflicted upon them. These experiments, though widely cited in psychology, have faced intense ethical scrutiny. Many argue that the suffering inflicted was unnecessary, as similar concepts could have been studied in human clinical settings without resorting to torture. Modern psychology has moved toward more ethical research practices, but the shadow of Seligman's experiments still looms over discussions of scientific morality. Today, we must ask, should knowledge gained through cruelty be considered a success? Can science justify torture in the name of progress? And if we recognize the horror in what was done to these dogs, what does it say about the way we continue to treat animals in research today? The legacy of these electroshock experiments is one of pain, suffering, and difficult ethical questions, questions we must continue to confront as science advances. The Pit of Despair. Harry Harlow's Cruel Isolation. Experiments on monkeys. Harry Harlow, an American psychologist, conducted one of the most horrifying experiments in the history of psychology, pushing scientific cruelty to unimaginable levels. His research on love, attachment, and social deprivation turned into a series of brutal experiments that caused severe mental and emotional suffering in baby rhesus monkeys. He was obsessed with understanding how maternal bonds formed, but his methods involved extreme isolation, deprivation, and psychological torture. Harlow began by separating newborn monkeys from their mothers to see what would happen when they were given surrogate mothers made of different materials. Some were given a wire mother that provided milk but no comfort, while others received a soft, cloth-covered mother that offered warmth but no food. The results were disturbing. The baby monkeys ignored the wire mother, clinging desperately to the cloth-covered one, even when starving. They would only leave the soft mother briefly to eat and then return as quickly as possible, shaking and terrified. This was groundbreaking at the time, proving that love and comfort mattered more than just physical nourishment. But the worst was yet to come. Harlow became obsessed with testing the effects of social isolation. He placed baby monkeys into tiny, dark metal cages that he called the Pit of Despair, where they were completely alone for weeks, months, or even a full year. The monkeys had no sight, no sound, no touch, just pure and total sensory deprivation. At first they screamed, scratched at the walls, and frantically tried to escape. But after a while, something even more terrifying happened. They gave up. They stopped fighting. They stopped moving. They sat motionless, staring blankly, refusing to eat or interact with anything. When they were finally removed from isolation, the damage was irreversible. They were no longer able to interact with other monkeys. Some mutilated themselves, biting their own bodies, tearing out their fur. Others became completely unresponsive, unable to function in a normal environment. These monkeys had been broken, mentally shattered, their ability to live and connect with others destroyed by the very scientist who claimed to study love and attachment. As if that wasn't cruel enough, Harlow wanted to see how these socially destroyed monkeys would behave as mothers. But the isolated female monkeys refused to mate, so Harlow devised a brutal solution. He built what he called the rape rack, a metal contraption that forcefully restrained female monkeys so they could be impregnated against their will. Once they gave birth, their maternal instincts were non-existent. Some completely ignored their babies, refusing to care for them. Others physically attacked them, biting or even killing them, incapable of forming any emotional bond. The cycle of trauma continued, generation after generation, all in the name of research. Harlow's work had undeniable impacts on psychology, shaping modern attachment theory and influencing how hospitals and orphanages care for children. But at what cost? The suffering he inflicted on these helpless animals was unspeakable. Even in his time, scientists and activists condemned his methods as unnecessarily cruel. Today, his experiments would be considered outright torture and would never be allowed. Yet, his legacy forces us to confront an uncomfortable question. How much suffering are we willing to inflict in the name of knowledge? If understanding love required such unimaginable cruelty, was it worth it?